We're here for a talk about tarot for perfumers with J.W. Dotson. And just to introduce James is a psychiatrist with a fascination for the strange borderlands of fragrance. His interests include ethnobotany, alchemy, classical astrology, and archaic and traditional medicine. He has been a perfume blogger at Sniffapalooza magazine and is the first recipient of the Now Smell This Le Prix au Faux Award, which is great. And I'll turn it over to Mr. James. Thanks, James, for doing this.
Okay, so Saskia has done some housekeeping. I just wanted to do a couple quick things. So at the bottom, I've thrown some information. I have my Instagram handle at Yatromantis. So let me give you guys an overview of what we're going to be doing. So though I named it Tarot for Perfumers, I just want to start out by saying this is really meant to be accessible to anyone who has any kind of curiosity about perfume and or tarot or any combination thereof. And I think one of the primary goals of the Institute for Art and Olfaction is to make perfume knowledge more accessible to people because it's been locked up in this guild mentality. So I always try to do that. And the other thing that I will focus on or will be talking to you about is I encourage praxis, meaning like just get in there and do stuff. Like if you want to learn about fragrance, you should be pulling out some fragrant materials and using them. And even if you only have a slight curiosity about tarot, I would encourage you to get cards or to get an app and just start digging in and start working with it, because I think that's really the best way to learn about it. So by way of overview, this talk focuses on the intersection of perfume as a topic, which is huge, and the huge topic of tarot as well. I consider them both art forms, and this is the Institute of Art and Olfaction, so there will be some art talk in here. And I think a goal that I'm hoping that people will get from this is that they'll have some skills so they can translate the visual images on the cards into scents. The way that I'm going to do that is I'll be going through some examples and principles, and I've chosen 3 tarot experts. These are people who have all written books on tarot, and they have all written about perfume. So they do mention some correlations. I'm going to go over those. The other thing is that this is meant to be accessible, but this is a deep dive because not all knowledge is digitized, and I've really tried to focus on things that you're just not going to find on the internet. And also, there are some things which are digitized, but they aren't really curated well. They're hard to navigate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So this is hopefully stuff that's fairly new to you, and I hope you're able to use it. So what else was I going to say? Oh, so yeah, let me make a comment. This image on the right. So this is something I stole from the internet. I have a little tiny credit, Oliver Gal, artist. The reason I like it is because this person has created a tarot card out of Chanel No. 5. So why this is important to start off with is just to give you a little orientation to cards. So in the center, we have an image. In this case, it's an incredibly iconic image of Chanel No. 5. So this image is so iconic that there's like an entire Andy Warhol series of Chanel No. 5s. Under it is the title of the card, the classic scent, and at the top there's a Roman numeral. So today we'll be talking about the 22 Major Arcana. And so besides the image, there are other things that people do integrate into the interpretation of tarot. Both the title and the number could be, an important part of that. So let's just start diving in. So we're talking about Chanel as an iconic figure. We're going to talk about icons right from the very beginning. So in the center, I chose another Andy Warhol. This is part of Andy Warhol's skull series. So I love skulls. We all have one sitting in our head right now. They're super iconic. Andy definitely chooses very iconic images, and tarot is all about that. So one of the skills that you will be using for interpreting is iconography. So down below, I've written the Greek roots of that, which would be icon, which means image, plus graphe, which means writing. it's really just image writing or storytelling, with images. So when people talk about reading the cards, they're literally reading a string of cards, putting them together into sentences, into narratives, into poems. And that is something that you can learn to do. Iconography is not just something for an art history class or for like a film theory class. It's something that you can actually, start practicing and employing as a way of translating this. So I've also just mentioned again the number and title of the cards. So let's look at the left. This is the first card that I'm bringing up. This is the Salvador Dali tarot. So the backstory in this, excuse me, which is kind of fun. He was asked to do a tarot deck for a James Bond movie, Live or Let Die. The movie is fantastic. It has a tarot reader named Solitaire. But the problem was that he wanted too much money, so he backed out of it. But his wife and his muse, Gala, was super into tarot, and she told him, like, you're just going to make that deck anyway. So it's believed that she probably is responsible for a lot of this, as far as the images in his tarot deck, which has been reprinted by Toshin recently. So let's just look at this just to kind of point out the important things. So there's a large image in the center. Beneath of it is the title, Death. You see the Roman numeral 13. I think people know that 13 has lots of associations that are quite unlucky. And in the lower right, we see this little glyph. That is the planetary glyph for Saturn. It's supposed to look like a little scythe. Now, up above, up in the upper left, there is a letter from the Hebrew alphabet. I'll be talking about this a bit later. There are 22 letters in the alphabet. So, of course, mystically inclined people decided that they would, they belong to the cards, and they don't all agree on which one is which, but they do. It is something that's, part of tarot. Now, the central image, you see the skull, and then you'll see the cypress tree, and then he has a rose in the corner. So let's focus on the cypress tree, because I'm going to come back to this. So not surprisingly, cypress is a fragrance that has been associated with the death card. So traditionally, going back thousands of years, these very tall types of Mediterranean cypress appeared in Mediterranean graveyards. They're super traditional. And so over time, they have been very much associated with death. And we do use cypress, of course, in fine fragrance and other sorts of applications now. So this already pops out as something that you can pull as an association. Now, over to the right, I threw this advertisement in because advertising also uses a lot of iconic imagery. There's some thought that advertising is like modern day sorcery because it commands your attention and compels you to spend your money. So this is a can of water. It's a canned water. And as you can see, it shares with the card, it has a skull and it has the word death. So this is considered this incredible success story. It's only been out for a couple of years, but this guy, who's I think an art director, he chose to do this liquid death, and it obviously has worked as far as like advertising because it sold huge numbers of cans. And so I find it's fun that this sort of something that's like a tarot card could appear also just in other types of things like advertising. Okay. Next. So I'm going to talk a lot about scent as a type of communication. So as a chemosensory sense, I think a lot of us are pretty familiar. The animals have pheromones that, like night blooming flowers, are shooting out these incredible aroma chemicals, which are attracting moths from miles away. And so in the natural world, it is a type of communication, but I also think it's also, even in fine fragrance and so on, you're always telling a story. This links us in with tarot because tarot is also a type of visual storytelling. So both of these function as these kind of symbolic languages, and both of them are art forms. And so I will be focusing a lot on this just as like, how do we tell stories? So to the right is an advertisement for Evening in Paris, which was this very iconic fragrance that came out in the 1920s. You can see in the lower left, there's this cobalt blue bottle. And the whole ad has this kind of blue tone. And the copy on it is it whispers lovely things to you. So it's like literally telling you that this perfume is communicating with you. So how does this work? We have a static image here. What's interesting is that when people read cards, they generally read them in a line. And so you'll get a sequence of images. And this is really familiar to what is referred to as semiotics of comics. If you want to like do a deep dive and read books on it, basically people seem to be inwired to read sequences of images, including possibly all the way going back to cave paintings, which are sequences of images that have been there for 40,000 years. So this is a very interesting way of reading, which is nonverbal. So what we're going to practice doing is translating, excuse me, visual images into fragrance. And one of the things that it's always a struggle is like, how do you find out a word that, that corresponds to a fragrance? This is something, you can take this incredible class through the Institute with John Biebel, where he talks about writing about fragrance, but it's really a struggle. You need to work on it. But by using your imagination, I think that's the best way to build your skills. And you get what I would call a cross-sensory descriptive power. A really good example of that, which we'll see in the cards, is you can see things, images, which if you were to reach your hand out and touch them, they would have a tactile quality. For instance, you might see a fabric that's silky, or perhaps it's furry like cat fur, or perhaps it's just this incredible brocade. And with time, you can translate that to fragrances, because there are a lot of fragrances that seem sheer. Some of them seem furry. You can describe them that way. Some of them seem to be very ornate and heavy. And other sorts of sensory things, for instance, if you're running your hand along a surface, it may feel smooth or it may feel raspy. And this can be something that's a descriptor. For instance, I always think of, for some reason, I always think of Australian sandalwood as having this slight raspiness to it, which I think to me helps me remember the qualities. So just as a sort of a heads up, some of the things that we're going to be looking at are things that we'll see in the tarot cards. Are location. You're going to ask yourself, like, where am I? Nature, culture, like how much of it is outdoors? Are there plants and animals versus how much of it is man-made stuff like buildings? The colors are super important. And here's where I'll give like a little, I think someone's mic's on. Here's where I'll give like a little.
Actually, just for a sec, James, for everybody, would you mind making sure you're muted? Because otherwise it'll interrupt James's flow. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you.
Yeah. So colors. So here's like a little note. If you go to the Institute website, there's some links to my past lectures, which are on Vimeo and or YouTube. I did an entire one on color and fragrance, and I'm going to be referencing that. And if you're really into it, you can watch that. I also did an entire one on astrology, which I'll be referencing. And I did one on spices, where I talk a lot about qualities, like how do you translate hot, cold into a fragrance. But in the cards, also, that's very important. You'll have cards that have very cool colors, and you'll have cards that have dark colors or hot colors. Textures, as I mentioned, are there. Clothing, sometimes the figures are naked. Sometimes they have very heavy clothing. I think that's going to give you some hints. Are there animals? Are there plants? Are there interesting objects that might be associated with a scent? What's the weather report? Like, we will talk about this a little bit more. Like, what's the overall going on with the, tone of it? I think of tone as an example. You go to a play or opera, the curtain is pulled back and you have this whole mise en scène, like you have this whole scene set. It sets a tone, like you have some expectation about what it's all going to be about. And a lot of tarot cards are very much like stage sets, so you can kind of get that. Sounds, that's something I'll mention at least once, like, is there sound associated? And if it was a sound, how would you translate that to a fragrance? Okay. So now the big word, acrostic response. So what an acrostic response is, it's just literally a written response, usually in the form of an essay or a poem to something visual. Traditionally, like you would look at a painting, then you use your imagination to expand on it, to really pull out lots of features from what you see and communicate that in something very complex in a piece of art. This is very similar to when people do visual prompts in writing classes, and certainly if you've taken fragrance classes, sometimes they'll throw down like a picture from a film or something and have people try to work from there. It can work in the opposite way. I've had, with other senses. So I have here this album by Brian Eno that's called Neroli. So Neroli is the essential oil of orange blossoms. Brian Eno is super obsessed by essential oils, and he composed an entire album as a response to the scent of neroli, which I think is really interesting. Now, there's reverse things where people do, I don't remember which perfume school this is. I think it may be International Fragrances and Flavors and Fragrances, but there is an exercise in perfume school, which a perfumer has told me about, where people are presented, the perfumers who are in training are presented with a material, and they give them watercolors and paper, and they're like, we want you to paint this material, mint, for instance, and they interpret it in terms of colors and shapes. So is this just what's the purpose of this? This is interesting because the effort of translating it from one thing to another really solidifies it in your mind and actually really lets you grasp it a little bit more. So how does this work with tarot cards? So there is a technique called active imagination. So originally this came from Jung, the psychoanalyst Jung, who started the whole Jungian therapy. And this is prior to the 1920s. It is a kind of a meditative technique where you step into a landscape. In this case, you'd step into a card. I think people are much more able to understand this now because of virtual reality, because you would literally use your imagination to open the door to a virtual reality where you were inside a card and a tarot card, and you're interacting with it. In magical traditions, including tarot, there's this whole thing called path working or types of guided imagery, where they will lead people through specific tarot cards. Usually this is a way of incorporating certain metaphysical teachings and stuff like that. So is this just fantasy? I wrote here fantasy, something that's subjective or personal, or is it more than that? Well, according to certain metaphysical traditions, there exists this plane above us, which has multiple names. It could be the astral plane. It could be the imaginal world, the mundus imaginalis. And in Islamic occult traditions, it's the alam amnithal. It's this place of potent imagery. So the idea is that you use your personal imagination as a launch pad, but then you get into some place that's real. Actually, it's a world of imagery. And this is the world that you want to enter into because it gives you a lot of clues as to how to link things to the perfumes. Now, I wrote something about environmental scents because I just really very recently heard a presentation from a large perfume house who was discussing their new scents for the home, and they kept calling them imaginary landscapes. So they were really selling it as, hey, if you spray the stuff around your house, you have the power to walk into an imaginary landscape, which I think is interesting. All right. The other principle that I think is helpful for us as a way of interacting with oils is animism. So animism means essentially that things that most scientific folks would consider to be dead, that you see as being living beings. And this is true of a lot of traditional spiritual traditions, that they see rocks and trees and things like that as being alive. This book is very interesting. It's called Portraits in Oils. So this guy is a French aromatherapist who wrote this entire book where he creates these vivid portraits of various essential oils as if they're characters in a novel. It's super fantastic. But one reason why I think it's interesting is because it is possible, if you turn a specific fragrance into a character, that you could sit down and have a conversation with it and actually use that as a way of kind of just like pulling out information about it. Also, it's a great way to remember stuff. Like I remember he has this whole portrait of I'm going to say it's eucalyptus, where eucalyptus is this yogi on the top of this mountain, and then he discusses all these qualities of eucalyptus. It's just a fascinating way of kind of like really vividly putting something into your mind. It's also, he mentions this as a link to temperament qualities, and I will be talking about this, that, fragrances and cards, they have personalities. They could be warm and cold, for instance. And, I find these things super useful, but we will be mentioning cards as being alive at some point. Okay, perfume classification. Okay, this is directly from the bookshelf of the Institute of Art and Olfaction, which you see a bunch of perfume wheels. So most everyone starts learning about fragrance with a wheel, and you can see, if you look down there, you'll see the Atelier wheel, which a lot of people use, which I love. I think it's very user-friendly. It's easy to follow. But what I'm calling these classification or taxonomy systems, I'm calling them a convenient fiction, because in reality, fragrances are very tricksy. They don't like to stay in their lane. You may smell something that you could say something is rose, but in reality, if you smell actual living roses, you'll realize like, oh, this type of rose has this lemony, it smells like lemons, it smells like violets, it smells like musk, it smells like raspberries. So it is a super useful way to kind of get a grasp of fragrances, but I like to mix it up with these systems, because sometimes if you stay with one too long, you might get a little bit stuck. So people in the past have certainly used different systems. The beloved Septimus Peace, whose name belongs to one of the awards for the Institute for Art and Olfaction, which are coming up next month, had this whole musical scale system, which is fascinating and really is the basis for a lot of the ways that we talk about fragrance, because we talk about notes or accords or chords and things like that. Other things are color. As I had mentioned, I did a whole talk on color. Astrology is another way that you can classify them according to various planets and so on. And there's a whole bunch of other ways too. So one of the ways that I think is very important that I'm going to talk about is you can classify them by deities, that fragrances are associated with deities. So synthemata is a Greek word that goes back to ancient Greece, to what's called theurgy, which is a sort of mystical tradition of working with gods. And the idea is that the gods manifest these imprinted signature into the material world in certain stuff. They manifest as jewels, they manifest as plants, and importantly, it was always traditional, they manifest in aromatic substances as well. This is now, scholars seem to think this is probably really Egyptian, and it's derived from Greco-Egyptian priesthood things where they had living statues and they anointed them with oils and stuff. There's also parallels, certainly in African traditional religious practices, where deities manifest, of course, as plants and trees. And one way of working with the deity is through working through those particular plants. And we'll be talking about this because this ties into some of the stuff that's traditional for tarot cards, what are called Hermetic correspondences. I'm throwing this out already. So for instance, Rose has massive number of traditions with Aphrodite. And certainly there have been some classes at the Institute about Rose that Noreen McBride has done that talks a lot about these sorts of deity associations with a flower. Okay, so tarot is a divination tool. It's a tool for telling the future. I have this really fantastic perfume. I think it's fantastic because of the brutalist candlestick thing. For a perfume called Sortilège. So Sortilège in French essentially means, it just means like a spell, but it's the actual original meaning of Sortilège is a type of divination, and it comes from the Latin sortis, which means selecting lots. So selecting lots is essentially like pulling a name from a hat, though in ancient times, they would have an urn or container and they'd have various probably like clay tablets or whatever with a sign on them. They would come for, very important reasons, like, am I going to start this war kind of reasons? And in a ritual context, they would pull out one of these and it would be associated with something like the Sibylline oracles or something. And they would say, we have pulled this. It says this is what we should do. Now, card reading is essentially a form of this. Instead of having tablets, we have physical cards that we pull, and they are associated with certain like ideas or divination, things. So this is an extremely ancient tradition. And I just wanted to point out that the cards are essentially just a continuation of something that people have been doing for a long time. Now, besides being a way of telling the future, it is a super useful tool for getting stuff that's not accessible to your conscious effort. And this, I will discuss, is why artists have used it. In particular, I'll be mentioning the Surrealists because they were really very into using divination tools and using automatic writing and all kinds of things like that because they wanted to just really get into this unconscious stuff. Okay, now briefly, I keep mentioning perfume as an art. So tarot is an art form, and I just am giving this little header up at the right. There was recently a Whitney exhibit that focused on American modernism. And what's really fascinating is that they had the tarot cards of Pamela Coleman Smith. It's interesting because the academic art world is just acknowledging that this spiritual tradition and the cards are actually a very important part of our history. It really gives them quite a bit more gravitas and importance. And it also gives some attention to the artist, Pamela Coleman Smith. So we'll be talking about this particular deck quite a bit because it is believed that there's they say, Wikipedia says, there's 100 million copies of this. There certainly are a ton of knockoffs. I would not be surprised if this is true. It is the one that dominates most of the English tarot world. And I will be talking about it because it ties into what are the most common ideas about tarot correspondences, which come from this English occult group, the Golden Dawn. So Pamela Coleman Smith was a member of this secret occult group, and A.E. Waite was also a member, and he commissioned her to do a tarot deck, which came out in the early 20th century. So shadow culture is just an acknowledgement that history is written for the dominant culture, so Judeo-Christian culture and scientism, but underneath it, there's always a shadow culture of the bohemian creative people who are interested in things like divination and magic. And this is a book, I just threw that up there because it's interesting, Esoteric Secrets of Surrealism. There's several really fabulous books on surrealism and magic and the ways that they use these kinds of things. And next, so of course, tarot has entered the world of fashion. It has some time ago. And to the right, we have a high priestess from this Gucci show from just literally a couple years ago. She has these fabulous pearls, look like little moons on her. Sometimes the moon is associated with this card. And she has these very cool pale colors. There's a ton of other high fashion stuff. If you type in Dior Tarot, this is amazing video that they did in a castle. They did this whole series of tarot inspired fashion inside this historic castle. So it is big in this is the couture high fashion world. But just by way of a quickie history thing, tarot became very popular during the psychedelic or countercultural area, which is roughly from 1969 on, in which time a ton of books of tarot came out, a ton of tarot decks came out. They become much more available. Before that, finding one was really challenging. If you were not living in Europe, you could almost forget it. It was super hard. You had to go through a special order and all that. And over the last several years, there's been this huge wave of interest. I remember about 7 years ago, I was sure that it had totally peaked. I'm like, there's just no way, this is crazy. But over COVID, people became even more excited about tarot. So it's at an all-time high as far as just people who are putting up videos and so on and so forth. And one good thing is there's a lot of new artist decks, which are fascinating. A lot of them are very diverse. They focus on people from different cultures and other sorts of specific niche tarots, which are fascinating. And also, it's become much, I talked about surrealism, but writers have used tarot for a long time. And I don't quite know why this is, but younger poets have just gone crazy about tarot. There's lots of use of tarot in poetry because it's basically because it is a storytelling machine. So it's super useful, as we'll see. Okay, so finally, we're starting off with some perfumes. I wanted to get into this. So I'm starting out with this Dolce Gabbana perfume. If you remember, I pointed out that there will be a title on the card. This one has no imagery, but it is the moon, and it is tarot card number 18. I have never smelled this, so I cannot really comment on it. But this was several years ago. They had a series of several fragrances that were inspired. I know that they had an Empress, and I forget what the other ones were. I do know that I did read a review by someone who was a tarot reader who said that she honestly couldn't figure out like what the tarot card had to do with it. But, you know, this is a fashion thing. I think it was just inspired as an image. And they, in fact, used one keyword for the cards, and they used for the moon, they used the word the dreamer. And what they have in this one, as far as I know, this is from an online source, it has white flowers, lily and tuberose, sandalwood, musk, iris, and leather. So we will be talking about, you know, flowers and cards, but incidentally, the moon, which blooms at night, is highly associated with big white night blooming flowers. I did a whole talk once for IO on night queens, on night blooming flowers. So lily and tuberose definitely, you know, fall into that. Tuberose especially. The sandalwood, musk, and so on, I'm not really sure. Generally, if you're into binary genders, the moon is generally considered the queen of heaven. So there would be more of a female thing. And in general, it's cool, whereas the sun is kind of warm. So a lot of cooler scents are associated with this. But this is a more mass market fashion thing. Then, of course, the huge world that we love, the world of indie niche and artisanal perfumes. We have the very popular Los Angeles Black Phoenix Alchemy Lab. I'm sorry, this is like a little screenshot from my phone, but if you're not familiar with them, they're like darkly romantic, occult goth. They do a lot of partnerships with the witch community. They just did a partnership, I know, with someone, Matthew Venus. They did all these witchcraft Sabbath animals like black cats and ravens and stuff. This is just what they do. Clearly, these are also people who know something about tarot. So the perfume comes from someone who's actually sort of living with tarot, which I think is interesting and perhaps makes it a little bit deeper. And as you see this one, there's an image for the magician. Oh, also, wait, shout out. I do think there are some people here, as far as I know, there are some indie perfumers here who have done tarot fragrances. So you can put your info on the chat, but I'm excited that there are people who have done tarot fragrances. Okay, so this is like a 12-hour, it's like a 12-hour history, but I'm going to give you some things that I just want you to know about. So cartomancy is fortune telling with cards. And in fact, long before they're tarot, they're regular playing cards, and I read playing cards all the time. It's very traditional, and people use other sorts of cards as well. But for our purposes, we're talking about the tarot. So where does this come from? So in big bold caps, I've written mythic lineage. So this is a really big thing in tarot where, you know, there's all these traditions that tarot came from Atlantis, you know, that it came from these, you know, great masters who hid this wisdom in the cards, that it came from ancient Egypt. This is ahistorical, but I love it. I love anything that's legendary, and it's a big part of what tarot is. And let's be honest, perfume is all about mythic lineage as well. There's always stories about where formula came from, or stories about the ingredients that perhaps are not exactly real, but they are fun. They're part of what storytelling is for fragrance. So quickly, really the first cards were from Italy. The documentation doesn't really show them being used for fortune telling until about the 17th century, where there's, some sort of documentation about their use. Cards were super popular as card games. And so the Italian cards did come over to France. The most popular one was the Tarot de Marseille. And that came over probably like in the 17th century. And it is the card that most of French occultists were using for their tarot stuff. Starting in the 18th century and the 19th century, there's this whole wave of French occultists who wrote about tarot. And a lot of what we're going to talk about ultimately does come from them. So they are the ones who wanted to link it with astrology and with things like Kabbalah. And probably the biggies from the French scene are Eliphas Levi and someone who's wrote under the name Papoose. His name was Gerard Encos. He was huge towards the late 19th century, numerous students all throughout Europe. So he was very influential on tarot. But what we see mostly now are the English versions of this. And that's because there was a British occult revival in the late 19th century, as well as the French revival. And we're going to talk about the Golden Dawn, which is a secret society that created this whole line of correspondences, which do show up in cards. Okay, let me have my lemonade. So quickly, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, 1887, was the secret society. A lot of very prestigious people belonged to it, most notably William Butler Yeats, the poet. And he used a lot of the sort of magical teachings as far as his poetic practice and so on. And they do have probably in the English language the most important influence as far as tarot, and they have set up the most common sets of correspondences. So and the card deck that most people use for this is this Waite Rider Smith deck, which I will talk about in a minute when I talk a little bit more about it. But just basically, both of the members, both the artists and the person who created the deck were both members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Though A.E. Waite had his own thing that was a little more Christian, a Rosicrucian. So there's more Christian elements in his card, and also lots of roses and things that he was into. So I mentioned the Hebrew letters. So there is a Jewish mystical tradition of the Kabbalah that people may have heard of, but there was something else that was more of a Christianized European version, which people refer to as the Hermetic Kabbalah, and that has the most influence on this kind of magical system. So there's 22 letters, and there's 22 major arcana. So of course, they decided like, oh my God, of course, these cards were meant to incorporate this. And it became a very big part of like how they describe the cards. This use of magical letters is interesting. It's scholars like to use the word lettrism now, but there's a huge number of magical traditions. For instance, the runes are magical letters. There's an entire Islamic occult tradition of using the Arabic alphabet, each letter having magical sort of magical correspondences, astrological correspondences. Yes, in fact, sometimes the letters have incenses associated with them. There's this whole thing in Al-Buni in his book called Shams al-Marif that's all about that. But in this case, this is very Hebrew. So, or actually, I'm sorry, it's more like British occult version of the Kabbalah. There are massive numbers of astrological correspondences in here, and which I'll be talking about. But again, I did do astrology of the 7 planets kind of talk if you want to kind of get into that. There's some numerology as well, because the cards have numbers on them. So why did they want to even have all this stuff? So this was essentially more, and not to make, it's essentially a magical practice. They're interested in developing their spiritual faculties and contemplating with the cards, and not so much, quotes, fortune telling. So there's this very classist thing about what's divination and what's fortune telling. Basically, if you're a non-white person and you're poor or you're like a Roma person or whatever, it's fortune telling. And there was like a little bit of a shade that that was considered a lower form than divination, when in reality, it was those people who actually use the cards all the time and know how to use them probably vastly better than these kind of British occult people. But just, and it's an interesting part of card reading history. Okay, let's see. Let me make sure I'm doing time. Okay, good. So, finally, okay. Yay, we're finally getting into a card, or we're gonna do a deep dive. So, not surprisingly, I've chosen the devil. And it's because there's so much going on with this card. So we're going to talk about the image, but let's just acknowledge there's a title at the bottom, the devil, and there's a Roman numeral 15. There's a giant inverted pentagram on his head. He is a goat human hybrid with wings, and he's got these two. Are they humans? Are they demons? I don't know, but they're chained up. So there are some people who may just take a title of a tarot card and just go with it and create a story. And there's nothing essentially bad. I just think it's a bit limited. So you could decide, oh, I want to do the devil as Lucifer, like in the comic Lucifer, where he's this elegant LA gentleman who drives like a convertible and is really charming and is kind of like a dandy. Or you can do some of the visual cues, which is the way that I normally do it. So let's kind of go under this, and I'll just like go through some of these. So the title of the card is the devil. I wrote sometimes Pan because at some point in the 19th century, these occult scholars really started identifying the god Pan with this card. And I would say in the 20th century, this is also kind of common. I personally think it's an attempt to make the card nicer and less scary and de-Christianize it. But I definitely see that there's lots of parallels. It's kind of interesting. So first of all, what color are we seeing here? Like, what's the overall tone? Well, this is a really dark card. It appears to be somewhere in some subterranean cave. So right off, I think most of us, if you were to ask, what's a dark fragrance like, or what's a light fragrance like? We have a lot of ideas about dark fragrances, and I will say this probably like again and again, your personal associations are always vastly more important than what I say or what an expert says. So there's lots of dark ingredients, but in my mind, some of the things that I think of is it's kind of dense, it's maybe musty. I wrote down patchouli because patchouli is very commonly used in fine fragrances. Most people are familiar with it. And I think, I think that it, kind of captures this. It's something that's dark, basically. Next, where are we? We're in the underworld. So what do you find in the underworld? You find roots. The part of the plant that grows into the underworld is the root. And vetiver is probably one of the most common roots that you're going to find. And I think that that's an interesting association here. And one, again, that people might be familiar with, that this rooty, musky kind of scent is going to be associated with the scene that's from the underworld. Next, next, goat Capricorn. So the astrological correspondences, as we will see, become very important. And there are some tarot people who seem to be extremely focused on that. I like to see the astrology and the other things as an added layer of symbolism, but a lot of them just use it as their go-to way of classifying cards. So this is a goaty card, and the sign Capricorn is the goat. So it's not super surprising that they would, most people would choose Capricorn as a sign that is associated with this card. So here's where I get to use these like crazy scent words, which I love. So these are very archaic, but hircine and caprylic refer to goat-like smells. Sometimes I think hircine also means lusty, but and also I think sometimes they use these for flavors like of goat cheese. So what smells goaty? So my top of my list is valerian root. If you've ever smelled it, like I remember I tried to make tea from it once. It's like really horrifying, but it is something that is rarely, but is used in fine fragrance. And it has a very musky, kind of goaty sort of smell. There is a cousin to that. There's another type of root, spikenard, which is generally occurs in the Himalayas, which is much more common in a fine fragrance setting. There's like entire fragrance lines based on this. And it also has a somewhat more refined, I would say, kind of goaty fragrance to it. Next, animalic. So the obvious thing here is that we see a big animal in this card. And in perfume, when we talk about animals, we frequently use, we were referring to certain ingredients that are derived from animals or synthetics that mimic these. And the most common ones would be musk and civet. So I definitely see this as something that's characteristic of the devil. Next thing that I'm looking at, I see a torch there. Torches are very smoky. So to me, this brings up some smoky ingredients and several smoky ingredients that are natural. I think everyone kind of knows about pine tar. There are things that are destructive distillations that have smoky smells. So pine tar could be one. Birch tar is one that's used in Russian leather. That also is smoky. Cade is juniper tar, but anything that has a smoky kind of valence to it, I think would be interesting. The next thing I'm looking at is I'm looking at this guy's wings. So to me, I like, if I were to like walk into this car, like what would wings smell like? They don't literally smell leatherly, but like leather, but metaphorically, I would say wings are leathery. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, they would smell like leather. Now, pan, excuse me. So many people will choose pan for this card. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge this and talk a little bit about it. Pan and anything related to satyrs. So a little interesting side note, there was this very popular, during the early witchcraft revival in England, there was this occult oil of satyr oil, which was super popular. And to my knowledge from people who are familiar with it, it was mostly civet. So it's kind of fascinating that someone would name an oil satyr oil and use primarily civet, which is one of the things I talked about. But I would say where do pan and satyrs live? You know, they live in a pine forest. They may live in something that smells like moss, or they could live amongst the ferns. So these are all kinds of like perfume family notes and things that might be useful for us to think about. Okay. Oh my God, I have to drink something now. Hold on.
Do you need a little break, James? Or
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so we went from the devil to our first expert, Aleister Crowley. So to the right, I love this extremely lurid paperback, which is a biography from the 1950s that just goes on and on about, you know, no deity is too wicked, no sin too horrible, the wickedest man in the world, with this picture of this monster. So he died in the late 40s. This bio came out in the 50s. It was apparently rather popular because no one had ever seen a biography of someone who lived their life as a magician. It's kind of a big deal. He wrote prodigiously throughout the 20th century, but a lot of his books, honestly, basically all of his books were in very limited editions. Like I'm talking like 500 copy kind of editions. And they weren't super available till long after he was dead. But what happened during the psychedelic revival is they got widely reprinted. And, you know, tons of people started reading them because I wrote magic, drugs, sex. Those are the things he's known for. So he was a drug explorer. You know, he was one of the first people to write about mescaline. He wrote this book called Diary of a Drug Fiend. And he wrote a lot about sexual practices, magic of sex and stuff like that, and things that were also, you know, very transgressive and non-heteronormative and stuff like that. So he became popular. When his stuff came out, a bunch of rock stars were really into him. David Bowie went through this entire huge Crowley time. The Rolling Stones, of course, were really into him, and he became this sort of psychedelic hero. And that is an interesting part of just like how he influenced the culture. But surprise, yes, he did write about perfume, and he did write about some specific correspondences with tarot. He wrote a lot about tarot throughout his life, usually in some of his publications, but he worked and worked and worked, and it was only towards the end of his life that he came out with his big book on tarot, which is the Book of Thoth. So this didn't even come out till a couple years before he died, 1944. He had one of his students who did the illustrations of this that are really amazing, Lady Frida Harris. She also like financially supported him for a long time, and she did these extraordinary paintings. And there was a show in London, and then the book came out. I swear to you, there was like something like only 200 copies. So there was only kind of very influential people had copies of this or saw the show. And it wasn't until much later, like in the late 60s, that they even did a deck out of this and then also reprinted this book where it became more available. I did this little tiny thing in bold at the bottom to remind me about the essay. So he describes the cards of the tarot as living beings. So I talked about animism. I mean, he's very specific that working with the tarot, it can be very helpful to conceptualize them as being alive, even if you don't believe they're living. That does help you create a relationship with the cards. So this book contains a lot of very interesting stuff about the tarot, and of course the deck now is like widely available. So what about him and perfume? So he did have knowledge of perfume materials, and let me just go over a couple things about the show, what he was aware of. So he came from this very wealthy, privileged background. He attended Cambridge, and we do know that he had formal chemistry training. And in fact, one of his very closest friends was a professional chemist, this guy, George Cecil Jones, and he was the person who introduced him to the Golden Dawn and got him to join in. And he also describes that as I will tell you, in coming up with fragrance categories and the ways that they correlate in magical ways, he said that this person was helpful and gave him some suggestions. He also, in his writings, he had descriptions of fractional distillation and essential oils. These are things that you would really kind of have to be pretty knowledgeable about perfume materials to write about. And he also had this thing called the practice of the magical diary, where all of his students were required to keep a very meticulous diary, which is very much like the diary that you're supposed to do when you're working with perfume. You're supposed to do careful notes, write it all down. This is a basic lab kind of, golden rule. And, this is central because he felt like this was just a practice that you could use for lots of different things. Now, the last thing I think is maybe the most important. So like, how would he know about all these things, or where would he get them? Well, he had his own personal pharmacist in this very chic pharmacy in, I believe it was in Marylebone, a very fashionable neighborhood of London. The guy's name was Wineray, and he was someone who was actually knowledgeable about certain psychoactive drugs. And he reprinted one of his articles, I think, on hashish. But this guy got him everything, including very unusual, rare stuff. He wrote this whole like little mini essay on galbanum, which I mentioned because if you're not familiar with it, it's ferula that is from Iran. It's this beautiful green resin with this gorgeous bitter scent, but it's really hard to get. Like, it's not like how the hell would you get that in London? You would have to know someone. So he clearly was able to get these materials, and there's documentation from various people in their biographies that this person obtained all these aromatic materials for him. And, as well as obtaining like mescaline and cocaine and stuff like that when they were legal. Okay, so the other thing, and this is less known, how else did he maybe know about perfume? So he lived with a perfumer, actually a very famous perfumer. This is kind of a fascinating little side story. So Mary Dusty Sturgis was this fabulous, glamorous American woman who had a husband somewhere in the United States, but she wandered off to Europe for like 9 months out of the year. And between the years of 1911 and 1912, she physically lived with Crowley in various places while they're working on a book together, and had an ongoing affair with him. She had founded a perfume house in 1911, which is the same year that she met him, called Maison d'Este. This place had an incredible reputation amongst French perfumers. There's this whole story where a major perfume house had tried to buy her out because they were very impressed by her work. And she also knew all the right people. Her best friend was The dancer Isadora Duncan, and she's friends with the designer Paul Poiret, who did her shop in this extremely fashionable neighborhood. And they had Lalique and Baccarat and all these really incredible glasses. And this is a little ad down there that talks about her shop in the Rue de la Paix. And later, she also had a Park Avenue boutique. So she was like a kind of a big deal perfumer who was very well respected. If you can read through his diaries focus on their magical relationship. They don't really document their chit chat. So I'm not really sure, but I just find it's fascinating that he spent all this time with perfumer. I assume he must have sort of picked up something because he was with her this whole time. Here's another fun ad of some of her perfumes to the right. So she was a seer, she was clairvoyant, and they would have these ceremonies where he would burn incense, the incense of Abramelin. She would go into a trance and contact various spirits who worked on this book, book 4, which is considered one of his major books, a book which really central to a lot of his magical philosophy. So the author, it says Frater Perdurabo, that's his Latin magical name, and she went by the name Soror Viracem. So he gave her a co-authorship on this book, which is very interesting. He obviously must have had quite a bit of respect for her. It's kind of shocking because it wasn't very nice to most women. That puts it mildly. So this is interesting. And her son was super famous, Preston Sturgis, one of the most famous screenwriters of all time. He only writes about Crowley as this horrible, monstrous person, and we don't really have much else by way of observers about what else went on. But they did end on fairly good terms because there's also things where he saw her later on, and they seem to go to the same parties and so on. Okay, so now the perfume. So this is the book where a lot of you'll find these perfume things. And as I'll mention in a minute, this, you can find things in the public domain. And hold on while I just turn on a light just a second. Okay, I'm back. So he produced this book, Libre 777. It came out in 1909. So he was a member of the secret society, the Golden Dawn, which I'll continue to talk about because it keeps coming up. And as part of that, he was presented with a lot of material about magical correspondences, which did include perfumes or incenses. And he basically took the secret material and stole it and printed under a assumed name, though everyone knew it was him. And I think they tried to sue him, but it was too expensive and they gave up. But I'm sure his point of view was that this magical knowledge needs to be some jailbreaking so that everyone should have access to it. Though, on the other hand, he did steal it from him. It's interesting. But this contains what I would call like this giant chart of correspondences. It's like a massive spreadsheet where everything corresponds to everything else. And the reason why this is important is because certain magical practices depend on you manipulating these different correspondences. So it contains perfumes, other plants, and there will be things that correlate it with tarot. So this center thing is super important because it gives you his magical theory. He says a proper comprehension of the virtues of perfumes is of the utmost importance to the work of the Adeptus Major, for they constitute the most vital link between the material and astral planes. So once again, he's talking about the imaginal world. He feels the perfumes are the secret key to the imaginal world. They open it up. They allow you to manipulate these magical images and use them in magical practices. So, he rates this as very important. So in a minute, we'll come to the column that gives the perfumes. It's column 42. And he says that these came mostly from tradition. I'm going to talk a little bit where he probably got them from. Some of them with legends, other are derived from clairvoyant observations. So if you want to go back and listen to my talk about color, I have a whole thing about people who, just like people do aura readings, they did a reading, they're like, I'm going to do an aura reading of frankincense. And then they tell you that the such and such of colors and things like that are associated with it. So this is implying that that's what it is. But he also says the basis of the attribution is less apparent in this column than others. So some of this is guesswork about where he got it, but we're going to start to dive into that and talk about what's what. Okay, so after he died, he had one of his primary students by the name of York had his notes. So he had been working on a revised version of this book forever and ever. He didn't want to revise the actual fragrances, but he wanted to add more explanatory text. And so in the 1950s, a revised edition of this appeared, which contained his annotations and his longhand notes that he had written out. And this is available online as a free PDF. If I would suggest that's the one you could look for, but you can find this. And what you'll be looking for is a specific column that says perfumes. Up at the top in Roman numerals, our friend, the Roman numerals, let's say 42. We all have phones, so we can type that in and figure it out now, which I kind of had to do, though I sort of remembered it. The first 10 we're going to ignore because those are part of Kabbalah. They're the 10 spheres of the 10 spheres of the tree of life, and they are connected with planets and things like that. We're going to start from 11 onwards. Those things are all tarot cards, and we're going to talk, excuse me, a little bit about what those are and what they may mean. I set up. Now, he, to his credit, after he wrote all this down about this, he said, in all cases, you should undertake your own experimental investigation. I totally agree with this. Him meant, don't really take my expert words as gospel, start working with the substance and try to come up with your own ideas if you think that it makes sense or doesn't. Okay, so, excuse me, we're going to dive in a little bit closer. All right, so let's look at the pink line, and that is the card, the devil. So we do remember we're looking at that. So he lists his primary things, musk and civet. So he does agree that these animalic things would reflect the character of the card, the devil. The other thing says also, and that's a little Saturn. Perfumes says it was Saturn. And then he lists orchid root, which doesn't really have a fragrance, but it's heavily used in sex magic. Excuse me. The moon we looked at for a half second, we'll come back to. He gives ambergris, which is interesting. Of course, it comes from the excreta of a whale. It's very much associated with watery things. And he gives menstrual fluid. Okay, that seems kind of out there, but he was very into sex magic, so this is not surprising. However, this is very traditional. Of course, the moon cycle of a month does correspond to the menstrual cycle. This is something that we'll hear about a lot. But if you're interested in experimental scent practices, last year at Art Keller, there was a show and there was a piece called Menstrual Garden that had all menstrual related scents. So this is not super outlandish. It's interesting that he would mention this. He mentions all narcotics, so things that are considered intoxicating seem to fit under the moon. Okay, moving quickly forward. The next person who's very interesting is a French esoteric person, Valentin Brel. He was part of the Parisian demi-monde. He was a publisher of literary and poetic works. He was very involved with surrealists. He lived in his crazy apartment in Montmartre, which was something, it sounded like it was some filled with goat heads and altars, and it was very wizardy. And he sort of wins the award here for doing not only a book on perfume, but also a book on tarot. So the book on the perfumes and their magical influences came out first in 1942, followed shortly thereafter by this book, The Tarot Revealed. And there was an artist who did these kind of sketch renderings of his ideas of tarot. I was excited when I found this perfume book because it actually has several specific areas where it associates tarot cards with perfumes, which we'll be looking at. And what's interesting is he was really part of Parisian perfume culture. He will be mentioning synthetics. The one Crowley was using things that you would find in the early 1900s. He really just references natural materials, but this person really references, Parisian perfume and that sort of thing. He had this whole poetic thing that he was interested in. He did some work with Andre Breton, and he was very into love magic. And as a kind of a quickie aside that I think is really cool, he felt if you were trying to send like telepathic messages to someone, you would use imagery, but you also needed to use perfume, because the perfume like boosted your signal so you could like psychically influence someone using a perfume telepathy, which he called like amorous telepathy. Kind of fun. Please try this at home. Okay, so I have the Empress card from the Pamela Coleman Smith deck as a reference. You can see this giant female symbol, which is the symbol for the planet Venus. And most tarot people just go straight to this, and all they talk about is this is Venus, Venus, Venus. There's a lot else going on with this card. She's set in this beautiful natural setting. She has this voluminous outfit. You could kind of go off on the fabric. A lot of people feel that she's pregnant and that this is a card of like generating new things. But because it's Venus, roses will show up with this. And as I said before, their associations with Aphrodite, Venus go way back. There's whole stories that when she popped out of the sea, she had like roses with her. And also there was cultic use, meaning like, for instance, using rose crowns and other roses in her worship, really big. So we will see what he has to say with the Empress right here. Okay, so here is some of his columns of tarot cards. So we are looking at number 3. That's the Empress. He has yellow as the color for the Empress. Then he has a list of incense ingredients. If you get into perfume at a certain point, you will be forced to learn the French words, but I'm going to translate them for you. So there's a lot of flowers here. Venus is the queen of flowers. She's always shown like trailing flowers. And so not surprisingly, there's lots of flowers in here. So the first thing though is Angelica root. Interesting. It is a sort of musky scent, and in Chinese medicine, it's actually, I think, considered like the female, I have to speed up, the female version of ginseng. So it's interesting. Benzoin, which is sort of balsamic and vanilla-like. So cyclamen is a synthetic. So this is the first synthetic thing. There is no natural cyclamen, but there is a cyclamen aldehyde, which has been around for a long time, which is usually what they mean when they discuss cyclamen. It's like a fresh green kind of floral. Incense, then a bunch of flowers. Hyacinth, jasmine, lavender, lilac, lily, and of course, rose. Now, our favorite, the devil. He has a lot of associations, just like I did. So he has these colors like dark red and dark green. So absinthe usually refers to wormwood, but could also refer to the liqueur, which has this very strong anisic thing. And that's the very next thing he mentions, which is anise. Next is arbutus, which is obscure, and I don't really know what it smells like, so we'll skip that. The next is asphalt, bitumen. And if you've ever been to La Brea tar pits, I recommend you go lean in there. So asphalt, what a great scent for like the devil in the underworld. It's fantastic. And it is something used, like Comme des Garçons has these tarry kind of fragrances. It's fantastic. So Bruyere is heather. I don't really know why he chose heather. The next one, chanvre, it's hemp, and essentially it's cannabis. Cannabis is frequently associated with, it's of course a scent now. It was never used in perfume at that time. Presumably he was like burning this in his incense and felt like it was important to get the devil thing. He has civet, as we discussed. Then the next thing is Russian leather, Cuir. Interesting. That's both leather and the destructive distillation of birch tar. So eglantine is a type of rose, and there's spices, fougere, fern. That's maybe pan. There's clove, mint, musk, carnation, Pepper, rue, which we don't really use because it's so dermatotoxic. Sulfur, essentially a devil scent, but not usually used in perfume. And thyme, that's kind of a puzzle. I don't know that. Okay. The third person is Mary Greer. She is a living tarot master, highly respected, multiple books for more than 40 years. And she wrote this book in 93 that correlates tarot with essential oils. So it's going to be all naturals, all essential oils. So she's a Golden Dawn scholar, wrote a book about women and the Golden Dawn. So of course there's tons of Golden Dawn stuff. And she does include some newer fragrances, which is interesting. Her stuff is for use in ritual, but she also talks about personal fragrances. And what's cool is that we'll see in a second, if she says rose is for the Empress, she'll also say you can use other rosy materials like Palmarosa or rose geranium, which have a lot of geraniol and are very similar, but less expensive. And I think that's interesting. Okay. She got a lot of her stuff. Tisserand is here. He's someone you may be familiar with. He was an early aromatherapist. This magical aromatherapy book had like 200,000 copies. She seems to have gotten a lot of her astrology stuff from this. And I don't have time to get into the whole aromatherapy thing, but she was clearly interested and read a bunch of these early aromatherapy books. So you can screenshot this. I apologize, it's kind of small. So she has multiple columns. The stuff towards the right is much more expensive, and the ones in the middle are less expensive. She uses in a lot of ways, mostly in ritual work, but she had this great tarot reading where she would pull a card and say, what do I need today? And she would use that scent as like the remedy of the day, which is something I'm really fascinated with. She also used numerology where you would add up your birth date and you can get a card. You can see this. I don't have time to belabor this, but you add up the days that you're born and you come up with a card. Like in this case, 21, the world, your scent would be whatever. So sorry, we have to rush through, but I have a lot to go. Okay, so just to look at the Empress as an example, she lists other sort of voluptuous kinds of florals. She has Lang Lang, she has vanilla, which is a balsamic scent. And then towards the right, she has rose and then the other kinds of things there too. If you go down to death, you'll see that she uses cypress, which I mentioned at the very beginning. Okay. And she had these talismans that she infused with tarot oils. And this was a long time ago. I don't think this exists anymore, but this is one of the ways that she worked with the oils. Okay, so now I'm going to throw through a few more cards. Sorry, we're kind of towards the end. So I use this Aquarian tarot because I like the color, which is very cinnamon. And in fact, as we'll see, cinnamon is a scent associated with the sun. So from antiquity onwards, frankincense is a classic sun god kind of material. I mentioned this Greco-Roman pyre. It appears like all over the place. So Crowley gives frankincense. Cinnamon is warm, and so it's very much associated with the sun. Greer sticks with that, and she has cinnamon and frankincense. She includes mandarin because citrus scents are frequently associated with the sun. Nowadays, if you see the word sun or soleil on a perfume, it almost always refers to tanning lotion. And I mentioned some things, it could be citrus, the salicylates, white flowers. It's what they're really referring to is like summer vacation, which I think is a perfectly interesting association with this card. Okay, so visual cues, here's death. We mentioned in the beginning. I think of this as a bare bones, like there's no flesh on it. So this could be a very pared down kind of fragrance. It could refer to a season. This is an agricultural tool, the scythe. It could refer to harvest, which gives us, the fall, of course, Halloween, because it's a skeleton. Death scents are things like indoles that are found in florals like jasmine. So you might want to be very literal and take something that smells like death. Crowley thought that the Scorpio was the sign for this, which not everyone agrees on. But he used Apopanax, which is a type of sweet myrrh used in Shalimar, things like that. So Brel used chrysanthemum, which is a classic death flower in France. Like, don't ever bring it as a gift to people because it's just for funerals. But there are natural chrysanthemum absolutes, which smell incredible. And poppy is also an underworld flower. It's a fantasy flower. And as I said, Greer would give cypress. The tower, I'm so sorry, I'm rushing through this. I see it as a card of destruction. Most of the tarot people who wrote on fragrance seemed obsessed with just using Mars. You'll see a tiny Mars over on the right in the Crowley deck tower. And the classic Marseille one shows the lightning bolt hitting the tower and people falling or escaping from it. So pepper seems to be the primary one that these people use. I think Brel also mentioned carnation. I mentioned trigeminal sensations, that you get something that's really hot that makes your nose tingle. Destructive distillations would work. Those are things like pine tar and so on. I see this as being a loud fragrance. You can use your imagination on what that might mean, because it's like a boom. This whole card is about booming, and maybe it would be a high impact top notes. And then overdose crashes the perfume. I see this as like a weird functional message, like too much of something makes the whole thing fall apart. Or if you're really clever, too much of something maybe creates a spectacular kind of effect that is something that you want. All right, the moon. On the right, we see the classic moon. So Crowley gave ambergris and narcotics, this hippie incense cone that says black opium. Interesting, because it's also narcotics, an interesting fantasy. Brel gave these classic things. It's cold, it's camphor, cannabis, mind-altering. Water lilies, of course. Water lilies are associated with the moon. I associate it with twilight, cool, desolate. It could be like a water thing. So last of all, let me finish with this because I have to give time for questions. Here's one that I came up with, which I think is interesting. So thanks to Mary Greer, who had an essay on this topic, basically. So if you look at the moon card, you'll see what looks like two dogs, but traditionally it's a dog and a wolf. And there is a French expression, entre chien et loup, which means between dog and wolf. It, in fact, is based on an ancient Latin saying, inter canem et lupum. And it refers to twilight, because at twilight, if you're at the edge of the village, is that my dog or is that a wolf? Is it safe or is it dangerous? It refers to umbral, which means like a shadow or transitional time that's unsettling. In French, there's another word called l'heure bleue, which is a literary term about the twilight where the light is very beautiful. It is a time of illusion. So there's an entire perfume by Guerlain that came out in 1912 called L'heure bleue, which I feel matches the moon quite well. It's an anisic floral with this powdery heliotrope, but the whole mood of it, I think, is interesting. And this is interesting because it refers to a specific time, which is twilight. So, okay. All right. I need to give you guys time for questions. So I'm going to stop that. Let's see.
Thanks, James. You're so prompt.
Oh.
So there was tons and tons and tons of comments, but let's see, in terms of questions, does anybody have a question they want to pop in the chat for it?
Now, is my screen off now? Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure. Now you can actually see the questions too.
Yeah, I apologize but I had way too much material.
No, I mean, you always have what's the word? A celebration of research, or what would be the word?
Oh, wait. Okay. So can you read this? Let's see. What does it say?
Yeah. Question. Have you ever explored this with Lenormand cards?
Lenormand cards. So yes, thank you for asking that. So I only talked about the Major Arcana. There's a whole thing where people have fragrances associated with the court cards and the minor arcana, which is mostly based on elements. Like if they decide cups, for instance, are associated with water, then they would have watery things. Lenormand is a whole tradition of cartomancy, mostly from Europe, where they have symbols. I think it would be fantastic because it has iconic symbols, like there's a key or a gentleman collar or whatever. And it would be, I think someone should do it. It's very, very interesting.
All right, friends, enjoy your evenings, and thank you for your time. And
thanks, Saskia.
Thanks, James. I'll see you soon. Well, we'll be in touch. Bye, everybody.